I know there's lots of reflection and thinking about the legacy of colonialism, of which kind of the whole activity of mission has got caught up.
I had to go through a huge deconstruction, almost getting to the point of like, oh, are we the villains in the story?
How much are you consciously thinking about healthy masculinity and that as part of your role in public? And how much is it that you're just a man trying to be healthy?
Once or twice a week I'm in a prison and I'm sitting with men and I know their whole life would be different if they had heard those words.
Hello and welcome to The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield, and this is a podcast about the deep values of the people shaping our common life. Every episode I speak to people from a really wide range of different political, metaphysical, professional perspectives and try and get under their public profile to what's going underneath, what's driving them. And today I am with poet Joshua Luke Smith, who I'm really looking forward to speaking to. Josh, we're going to go straight in with a non-warm-up question. I have a feeling you can cope with deep. Tell me what's sacred to you.
The first thing that comes to mind is friendship. Is the sense of belonging that I found amongst people. And how much of my whole spiritual life is included in one kind of singular interaction with someone where I feel like, oh, you see me. And I belong here. And kind of as I've got older, I've realized everything seems to be a footnote to that. And the manner in which I've found life worth living really is in proximity to those experiences. That question is amazing. And I can't help but think what's sacred to me comes out of what aches most within me.
Yes.
And that thought of do I belong has lived with me my whole life. And so when I feel it, there's a sense of it as well. Yeah. And this is perhaps what makes life worth living. Everything else is a footnote to this. So yeah, that's kind of where I would start. Yeah. Why
do you think that's been such an ache and a longing for you?
Yeah, I can respond to that, but honestly, this answer is recent. I don't know if we had sat down a year ago, I would have said this.
Okay, so it's fresh.
It's fresh. I'm a missionary kid, which means I grew up in a context of travel for the sake of my parents' heart to share the story of Jesus with people. I grew up in this environment. I was in northern Pakistan. We moved around constantly. When I was 14, we'd lived in 15 houses.
Wow.
Just moved around all the time and learned very quickly what I needed to do to adapt and to feel at home somewhere. Yeah. And probably in my teens came to an awareness of like the mosques that, work the best. And that evolves into, it can evolve into popularity without any sense of intimacy. Yeah. And in the, recent years, I've really begun to name that. There's an Anne Lamott line that I love. We are all the ages that we've ever been. Yes. And when I'm kind of processing, what it means to be Josh, it's really an 8-year-old kid who's standing in the, most recent playground or environment, looking around, asking, like, will you be my friend? Yeah. And one of my favorite questions to ask people, which I'd actually love to ask you, is, when you think about even the idea of God, what's the language you feel most able to use if you were to speak? Yeah. And I think I would love to use the word friend, but it's not that comfortable. Yeah. And so the ache is like, where do I fit? Where am I from? I would love to be able to say, this is where I'm from. You know what I mean? So where'd you grow up? Yeah. Where are you from? Like, what's your postcode? Yeah. What's the story? What's the common story of your life? Like, who are the people that know you since you were... And that's always been confusing for me. Yeah. So that's probably a part of the ache and a part of, like, the wounds that have expressed themselves in a myriad of ways throughout my life. Yeah. And what's sacred, man? Yeah, friendship. Yeah.
So I'd love to hear more about that Pakistan chapter of your childhood. And I think there'll be people listening who have associations with the word missionary, but they may not, and I'm aware I may be one of these, may not be entirely accurate. Like, we have a lot of this like Victorian imagery, right, about people going into the expanding empire with Bibles in their hands, like following the soldiers. Yeah. what were you and your family actually doing?
Yeah. Do you know what, like, I don't mean this at all insultingly, but my parents have an air of naivety about them. Like, we go out to Pakistan, they were 30 years old.
Right.
With a I guess, a 3-year-old, and I must have been, 15 months. We go out there, and my dad is working at a hospital.
Yeah.
And my mom's taking care of us, and then they find out that there's a need in northern Pakistan where people are going...
So your dad's a doctor?
He's a doctor. People are going blind, and all they need is a cataract surgery.
Right.
And so he moves to northern Pakistan with a few other families, and they build a hospital. Like, literally build the hospital.
Wow.
And just start doing cataract surgeries, just rolling, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And we live in community with all of our Muslim neighbors on this, like, compound.
Yeah.
And we live life.
Yeah.
And it was so simple.
Yeah.
And England was strange. Like, the absurdity was coming back here and having McDonald's and, running tap water that we could drink and David Beckham.
Yeah.
Those weren't familiar things for me.
Yeah.
For me and my sisters, like, we grew up in this very simple, naive space where we watched our parents love people, love people. And I know they had blind spots, and I'm sure they got a lot of things wrong, but I think it was the best introduction to faith I could have had. I saw them love people without reservation, without hesitation, and they've never changed in this respect. Whatever I have, that's yours.
Yeah.
So for my dad, it's like, nah, I don't want to do the GP thing.
Yeah.
Like, there's been times I'm like, Dad, you could have made some money. Like, we could have been all right.
Yeah.
And he's like, no, I can help people. This is what I'm gonna do. My mom, like, one of my core memories is playing in the garden and all these people coming out of nowhere and sitting on our lawn. And they were refugees, and they were probably coming from Afghanistan. Me and my sister run inside, we're like, Mom, there's all these people coming. And she's like, put out your hands, and starts putting everything in our kitchen into our pots, and then the potatoes in the pots, and give it to them, and go. And they keep coming, and they just sit on our lounge, and they start, like, clothing their kids with our clothes and sharing the stuff, and they're just on our lounge. You know what I mean? I backed up into a driveway the other day to turn around, and all I could think was, like, someone's about to come out and tell them, like, get off my driveway. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It was just like, that was my introduction to life and to spirituality and to community. And so, of course, there's things that I've had to work through in terms of the fundamentals of faith and, some of those very narrow, linear ways of thinking about it. But in terms of what I saw them do, it was, we just want to help people.
Yeah.
I got Francis tattooed on me because he's probably the image of the Christian that I most want to emulate. That's an image born in them,
Yeah.
Give what you have. Share everything.
Say more about St. Francis, because lots of people won't know who he is.
St. Francis was born in affluence and had a huge inheritance coming to him, but chose to forsake it in the wake of this conversion. And he heard God say, go and build my church. And what he did was very literal. He went and, like, started actually building a church out of rubble, and became aware of, like, no, I want you to completely revolutionize the way the church functions and works, love the people, bring back Christ into the church. And he did that. And it looked like him preaching to the trees and to the birds when no one would listen, and serving the poor and the sick. And they called him the last Christian, the last person to actually live out the Sermon on the Mount.
Wow.
And he changed the world. Like, he redefined what it meant to be a follower of Jesus. And I have gone full circle in my journey in that I had to, like, get some distance from all of it for a while, and then found myself coming all the way back around.
Yeah.
Francis was huge. I read a few books that introduced me to Francis, and it was that thought of, like, well, if this is what it means to be a Christian, perhaps this is what I've always known it meant, but I needed some distance from that early expression of it. Then sign me up again. Let's give this another go.
I want to get there, but first let's fill in some beats. So when you look back now, being raised in kind of majority Muslim country, high poverty, high need, in that really radical way that your parents were living, you've sort of said what's beautiful. What was hard about it, or how has it formed you in other ways? Yeah,
like, my first memory of there's something wrong here, which we all have. Some of that's behind closed doors in your house. there's a fly in the ointment. Mine is in a market, and this guy, he didn't have any arms, and saying to my dad, like, where's his arms? And my dad saying, well, he made more money as a boy without limbs, begging, and that sort of disturbance in my soul. And I think there was an exposing to poverty and to human tragedy that, I've never been able to shake. And I suppose going back to what we first spoke about, like, I was given a front row seat to these incredible experiences, but perhaps at times at the mercy of a simple, like, ordinary life that would have grounded me in ways that I've had to find grounding for later on in my life. My parents wanted to change the world, and in many ways I think they did. But for many kids who've grown up in that environment, as a family, you're on the altar of that. And there's definitely experiences of that for me,
Sorry, that noise is, we now both live in community, right, and are raising our kids, but that's the fear that stalks me. Yeah. Right, that we would sacrifice our kids on the altar of our idealism. Yeah. So forgive me for making a really horrible noise there.
I understand. I totally understand. And I think one of the things I love most about my parents is that they have gone on the journey themselves and have been so reflective about it. If my mom was sat here on your podcast, she'd be talking about throwing a Bible into the fire, in those days. And she never renounced her faith, but she went through the dark night of the soul and a great depression when there was no language for it, unless you were a Catholic mystic, you know what I mean? Yeah. And she, I think I can talk about it. It's like we grew up in the shadow of her depression. And ultimately that was part of the reason we left. You imagine going out to that country as a white woman and living in some of the restrictions, feeling like God has left you. So, there's a part of me that grew up with a suspicion about God, because we're called to serve him and we're called to do this work. And yet it looked to me a lot of the time that he didn't turn up with us, And again, I commend my mom for going on that journey of healing. She now sits with young missionary couples before they go out.
Wow.
And helps them discern whether it's right. And part of her questioning is, how do you view God? Who God is to you is who God is through you. And if you go out into these places with a distorted lens of God, that's ultimately who you're going to offer to people. And her thinking would be, people often go to the mission field in search of his approval. I'm going to do the most radical thing I can do to get the highest kind of acclaim. And I've lived under that shadow, I've lived under that impression of God a lot of my life.
Yeah. And do you ever listen in? I know there's lots and lots of reflection and thinking about the kind of legacy of colonialism in the last 5 or 10 years, of which kind of the whole activity of mission has got caught up. I think there would be some people who would even question whether it's legitimate to go to a Muslim country and be wanting to talk about Jesus. Have you kind of done any reflection on that yourself, or come up against some of those questions or those challenges from other people?
Yeah, for sure. I had to go through a huge deconstruction, I guess, of almost getting to the point of are we the villains in the story? And that was really difficult. I think it always comes down to the difference of kingdom and empire. And if our posture is, I'm going to a place to help amplify the kingdom of God that is already present here. I want to bring it in, it's here. Yeah. Let me help excavate it, rather than let me bring an empire, in the name of God. And honestly, Elizabeth, thank you, God. That has been my experience. It hasn't been, let me bring you white Jesus, with a British accent. Yeah. It's let me help be a part of your journey to see what God has already done here and is doing here. Yeah. And my goodness, that hasn't been the story. That isn't the overarching history of, the missionary effort. I know. Yeah. I've been to so many places around the world where you can see the afterglow of the narcissism, within that culture. But that isn't the whole story.
No, I mean, that's all of these questions, right? everything's mixed.
Yeah, absolutely.
Like there's hospitals and there's the human heart is so muddy.
Yeah.
And trying to go, okay, what can be saved from the fire?
Yeah,
right?
absolutely.
What is beautiful and what is not beautiful? And anyway, that's my current obsession. Like, how do we live in the tension?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's as much true here as it is going there. Like if your disposition ultimately is, I want to offer you something you inherently don't have.
Yeah.
We got a problem in the whole conversation. We're in we're starting from the wrong place, you know. I was in prison last week talking to the guys about the church. They asked me to do a talk about the church. And it was an amazing context to do it because I was just like, look, this is what the church is always meant to be, as in this, like in the prison chapel, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
Bunch of people in recovery sharing some bread, you know, like, and we've turned it into a game of who performs the best, and we take that out onto the streets, and it's excruciating.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to get back to those basics.
Yeah. And so you came back, how old were you when you moved back?
I was 9, I came back at,
It was a bit bumpy, right, for you?
Oh, yeah. I didn't know who I was. Like, I kind of make a joke about it, but being in the playground, not knowing who David Beckham is, at 9 years old, like, there's a displacement in you. Yeah. My accent was weird. Apparently it still is, you know what I mean? I really struggled with a sense of who I was. And I grew up in this story, like this deeply rooted story of Christ and the resurrection. It was everything. Mm-hmm. I lived in it. I swam in those waters. And I'm meeting people who either haven't had any exposure to it, or if they have, it's very optional. It's just a part of your life. Yeah. Not for us. Yeah. This is the entire story of my childhood.
Can I just stop and say, our cat is running around. If you can hear jingling, it's the community house cat. And she's having a great time. Yeah. And there's some mewing. She wants to get involved, but we're going to keep going.
And so just a sense of displacement. It's so interesting because as the years have gone on, I've become so grateful for that, obsessive world I grew up in, that mythology I grew up in, how deeply rooted that story is in me. Yeah. But that was so troubling for me. I was trying to shed it as much as I could, just trying to find the relevant conversations and culture that people were connecting in, you know what I mean? And found ways of doing that, many of which were destructive. I found hip hop. That changed my life. When I found hip hop, when I found music in general, that cracked something open for me because it was the common sort of language of internal searching for belonging, and I was like, oh my days, this is it. Like this is my tribe, Threw myself into that. But like my little girl, man, I got a 4-year-old, and every night, I'm not trying to make myself sound like a good parent here. Every night she says to me, she's in bed, and as the door's about to close and I'm about to sneak out, she goes, Daddy, can you tell me a story from the Bible? Yeah. Right? And she's asking me to tell her one of the stories that I grew up around. Yeah. Just like myth. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. And I'm realizing that this is my literary and literal lineage, these stories. Yeah. And I wrestled with that a lot. I wanted a story like everyone else, and mine was a little different. Drugs became a part of my teenage years because I liked them, and they gave me such a sense of camaraderie. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? Like those highs.
They can, right? There's a transcendence and a connection, which I write and think quite a lot about, how it's not that many clicks over from like ecstatic experience and spirituality. And we need to be more relaxed about the fact that those hungers are very related.
I love your book and the chapter around gluttony. Yeah. It rearranged some stuff in me. It was the first time I'd heard someone really put that together, where I'm in recovery, and you talk about how people with that sense of enthusiasm, God within, but it's unbridled and it's just trying to find its vessel, have a tendency towards some of this overindulgence and consumption. Yeah. And those highs that I experienced were incredible because they were everything you talk about, the spiritual, charismatic experience. But it was far away from that scene that I'd been involved in. It was a rebellion of that scene. It was actually the same thing. I was pursuing the same thing.
Yeah.
And that's taken me a while to recognize. But it was actually a very destructive high that I had, which again, you do reference, that pulled me back into the Christ story.
Right.
It was looking into the mirror with my face black and blue and grazes on my chin and having no idea how it had happened.
Wow.
That it was... Some people will be aware of the prodigal son story, just as like a pop culture reference. And there's a line in the story of this boy who runs from his father's home with his inheritance that he should have waited for after his dad's death and spends it on hedonistic pleasure. There's a point in the story where it says he came to his senses. Something in him just woke up, something in him rose up and woke up, and he saw himself. And I had that moment, and it was this clarifying picture of, who are you going to become, Josh?
Yeah.
Like, where are you going to go? Which story are you going to live in? And that was probably like 18, 19. And that's when I began, I wouldn't have called it then, but I began this kind of recovery path where it was, what does a sober life look like, where we actually begin putting on the table everything that we've been running from, you know? That's a huge part of my spirituality.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is there a poem that comes to mind around it? I can think of a few of yours I love, but what comes into your spirit?
Yeah. Me and my friends are older now, trying to make ends meet, raise some kids, and stay sober now. Trying to find closure for the things you can't get over. Trying to stay hopeful when you've been scarred like the Joker. Broken, beaten down, I don't even need provoking. The emotion just comes out at the most fleeting of a moment. Behind the man is a boy that needs consoling, someone to hold him and say they're proud. My faith and doubt are made of the same thing. I've tasted failure many times like a bitter drink. I used to think the saints wore halos like wedding rings. Now I see they just learned to turn their shame into better things. I'm trying not to numb my pain like ketamine. The art of facing and embracing a reckoning. Feel it all and turn up grace till it's deafening. Remembering the birds don't learn to fly before spreading wings. Yeah.
Thank you. Be a minute. There's another piece of your teenage years that I'd love us just to hear a little bit about, and that's neurodivergence. And it feels like one of the things in the public conversation that has really got louder in recent years, this sense that I'm always interested in difference, right? And how do we hold each other as fully human across these differences and across these disagreements? And it's both a kind of way of understanding ourselves that's been really helpful for many people, including many people dear to me, and also something that feels like occasionally gets like sucked into cultural war nonsense, right? So I'd love to just hear your experience, maybe particularly with ADHD or anything, for people who are like, I know that phrase, but I actually don't fully know what it is or what it's like to live with it.
Yeah.
Do you say a bit more?
I feel like I can talk about what it is to live with it, but I can't talk about what it is more objectively than that.
No,
you know,
maybe it's not just one thing. Right?
Yeah. I've done a little bit of reading, but you know, I think about my parents again and the chaos that they experienced with me in the house. You know, during those years we're talking about this kid trying to work out who he is and where he is, and at the same time throwing myself into anything that would give me a sense of belonging, not just with people, but, you know, things. And so school was like just the most limiting experience because it was like, you have to be here in this place and at this time. And so I was expelled 4 times. I was in fights. I was always sent out of class. And they started just getting a bit curious about it. Yeah. They were like, I remember there was one time we went to a parents-teacher conference. Yeah. And we got in the car coming home and my mom just cried the whole car journey. And I'm sat in the front seat. She's just sobbing. And I'm like, what have I done? Oh. And she just says, the boy they talked about is not my son. Wow. As in, that's not who you are. And it was really helpful. You know what they did? They turned the spare room into a music studio for me. When I say music studio, I mean like the oldest laptop in the house, and Dad put like some music software on it. And I just got obsessed. And I was like, And I'd come home from school and I would do it. And then I'd go to school and I would be rebellious or whatever you want to call it. Like, I remember like chewing gum, and my game was to throw it into the teacher's hair without them noticing it.
Sword.
So it got stuck in it, you know?
Yeah.
And I remember the one time I did it and it got stuck. And the minute it happened and she touched it, and as she touched it, she pressed it further into her hair. And she turned and she looked around. I haven't told this story ever. She looked at us and she looked so sad.
Yeah.
And I remember thinking, what have I done? And she went, in all my years of teaching, no one has done anything as cruel as this. And she left the room. And then in she came with the headmaster. And he said, who did this? And unless you tell me, you're all getting the consequence of it. And I put my hand up. And there was so many things like that. It was like I'd be in this environment and I would just, something would come out of me, you know. And I guess what I've learned along the way is there is a disposition somewhere within me, in my heart, in my mind, where, you know, given the right set of circumstance, this hyperactivity kicks in, this sense of restriction and limitation evokes a sense of like desperation and chaos, and it's got to go somewhere. And sometimes it came out in fighting, and sometimes it came out in throwing chewing gum, and sometimes it came out in writing poems, you know?
Yeah.
And that, you know, that my story has been, you know, it's got to come out somewhere and find the place that is ultimately redemptive and helpful and nurturing. And I don't know, to live in my brain, I think in one moment might feel really chaotic. It feels really safe to me now. Do you know what I mean? Like, I remember standing in this part of the school where it was particularly for people with neurodivergence, not that they called it that then, and they had just a board with everyone who had dyslexia or ADHD, you know?
Yeah.
Richard Branson and like Steve Jobs and Einstein. Yeah. And I remember that it worked. Like those things work. We had them in the prison as well. Yeah. It does work. We were like, okay, something could happen of this. Blessed are the meek, they shall inherit the earth. I've always connected with that. Blessed are those who can restrain their power. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not wrong to be powerful or to be chaotic, but blessed are those who can restrain it. You know what I mean? Yeah. Blessed is the dynamite that doesn't go off, you know, and there's something about handling your fire and not
so I'm wanting to go channel it. I sort of don't, and this is because I have different challenges, but there's a bit in me that's like dynamite. Like, how do you, like, what are the controlled explosions and what are the things that need detonating?
Yes.
Right? And how do you channel it for the good?
Yes.
Because I think the way that often happens if you feel in any way different, which frankly I think probably we all do in some way, is you like shut down, right? And you hide. And that in your work and in the work of artists in particular that I love, there's an unveiling, right? So like, what would it mean to just be honest? And then go, and how to be honest and healthy, right?
Absolutely.
Because there's unhealthy forms of honesty.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think over the years I've found that in my art more than anywhere else. Feel a call, again, if I can quote your book, like feel a call to peacemaking as a response to the temptation to keep peace, you know, and to be timid and vacant. I want to make peace, which sometimes does look like controlled explosions and, you know, the turning of tables. And if there's one, you know, plumb line of my art, that would be it.
Yeah, interesting.
Eugene Peterson helped me out where he said, the pastor and the poet have the same mandate to speak into the chaos. And I was like, I'm called to the chaos, you know? Like, I'm kind of comfortable with the chaos. I think I'm meant to live there. But just to kind of go full circle, and so much of what we've spoken about, I think the sense of sobriety and recovery within spirituality relates to all of this of, you know, living with joy, but it being sober joy. And, you know, this is a mentor of mine says, Josh, God just has you on a short leash, you know? And I like that. I hated it initially, but if you're on a short leash, you just walk in a little close to the master, you know what I mean? Like, I'm out, heal, son, heal. Like, walk closely with me. Stay close. Stay close. And sometimes I look at people and I feel like I don't have the liberty to go over there. I don't think I'm allowed to do that in the way that you are. I think part of my disposition could be a little more destructive with that length of cord. And I've wrestled with that over the years. I was in my recovery meeting literally before I came here. 9 a.m. on a Tuesday. I found a coffee shop down the road, and people, that was part of the theme today of like, so much of the life of recovery feels like just restriction. There is liberation in limitation. You know what I mean? And that has that has been a bit of my story as well.
Yeah. Tell me more about poetry in your life. This is a mad question in some ways, but I'd love to hear what you think poetry is.
I think the poet is a witness. The poet is here to witness life, to live poetically. I run a group for writing. Throughout the year, I do writing in prison, and the first thing I say is, I can't teach any of you to write poems.
Yeah.
But my hope and my desire is to help you live a little more poetically.
Yeah.
And the poet is a vocational life of living as a listener and as a witness, paying attention to the world around you, and offering words in service of the unsayable.
Yes.
Like I hope to offer words that don't, fill the gap for the sake of it, but bring language where there seems to be none. Yeah. That's what's happened for me. That's the first time I heard Tracy Chapman or the Fugees or read T.S. Eliot. They're not saying anything that perhaps hasn't been said before.
Yeah.
They're just saying it in a way that speaks to the deepest yearning of your soul. And to go back to your first question, says, you belong here. You know what I mean? If I can quote some Eliot towards the end of Little Giddings in the Four Quartets, he says, we will not cease from exploration, but arrive where we started and know it for the first time. That's poetry. It's like poetry introduces me back to my life that I might know it for the first time. Here's one that I'm loving at the moment. This is Raymond Carver. And did you find what you were looking for in this life? I did. And what was that? To call myself beloved and to feel myself beloved upon the earth. It's just like 4 lines and I can go about today. Yeah. You know what I mean? Like that was my meditation today. I was walking up the road just thinking about that. What was I looking for? To call myself beloved and to feel myself beloved on the earth, There's a Japanese poet I've just come across. I can't pronounce his name, I'm not going to attempt to. And he says, this is his poem, 71 years old. How did a dewdrop last this long? Or Wendell Berry, 70 years old. I suppose I shan't die young then. It's like, I don't know. It's just, okay, we can do today, So much of poetry is just that,
Yeah.
And the pastoral side of it is important as well. I am a pastor. I feel that deep sense of vocational in that world as well, as much as I tried to shake it. And I think the poetic life is a pastoral life. You live it. Proximity with people, I don't know. I feel sometimes a little skeptical or cynical of the writers that remove themselves from the world,
Yeah.
I think you gotta be in the story you're writing about.
Yeah.
And people have been my greatest, as I said at the beginning, my greatest kind of image of God and also my greatest thorn. And I know there's no way around it.
Yeah, there is something, isn't there? And I think it's true in good theology and it's true in good music and poetry. It's that sensation of being less alone, right? When our shared humanity goes twang and we are not. Just the existential loneliness of being a person is salved for a minute.
Oh, that's good. Twang.
Yeah.
I'm taking that.
You're welcome.
That's really good.
It just it's medicine for us. And obviously I'm on board a poetry person. I would love to talk to you about masculinity, if that's all right. I've been thinking about it a lot. We've got a Sacred Live coming up soon with Caitlin Moran, who has written a lot about women, and her most recent book's called What About Men? And it feels like we're in a moment, both politically and with how we're thinking about teenage boys, where this phrase crisis of masculinity gets bandied around a lot. And then there's other people going, there's no crisis of masculinity. And I'm like, I don't know what I think about any of this. But I'm deep in reflecting because I really care about these things that we allow to divide us, these ways that we identify others that can at their worst give us permission to dehumanize each other and forget our sort of irreconcilable interdependence. And I was thinking about all that when I first was coming across your work and thinking, gosh, there's a healthiness about the way you think and talk as a man in public that I don't always see everywhere. And I would just, particularly talk a lot about fatherhood, my question is really, how much are you consciously thinking about kind of healthy masculinity and that as part of your role in public? And how much is it that you're just a man trying to be healthy? It's not a very coherent question, but grasp for something with me.
Yeah. I'm gonna meander a little bit.
Please.
But 2 years ago, my friend Jermaine, an amazing poet, lost his son in Brixton. He was stabbed outside a Pizza Hut. And I got this call from another poet friend. Have you heard about what's happened to Jermaine? I was like, no. And then I got a message from Jermaine, and this is on like a Tuesday, and then so the next day, I go down and go to his house, take him some food, and then we walk to the vigil that night where his son was killed. And I'd never been to anything like that. Just like, I get there and Jermaine's wife just like falls on into my chest. It's like, you'll never not hear those sobs, you know what I mean? And we stand around these candles and these pictures and the whole community's coming out. And it's like, all I can think is, this is the world we live. Like, this is real. This is it. Like, he's gone. Kian, he's gone. And I've heard about this, but I haven't been in proximity to this. And, Jermaine's there and he's just there. And then the next week we gather for like a memorial, and he invites me and a couple others to like share some words. And we do it, and we just about get through all these pieces. And then Jermaine stands up. And none of us are expecting him to talk, but he gets up and he goes, I want to share with you tonight a few words about what it means to be a father. And I'm like on the edge of my seat. And he goes, there was a time where I came home from an overseas trip and I brought back a family heirloom. And I put it on like the shelf in a room, and I said to Keaton, I said, don't touch that, don't play with that. It's very special, Daddy. And then like a few minutes later, I walk out the room, I hear something smash. And I go in and I'm just like, he's so mad. Like, I just told you. And he looks at him and he's got like this cut on his, he's looking up at him, he's got his cut and he's bleeding, and he like picks him up and he takes him to A&E and gets stitched up, and he comes back and he walks into the room and the vase or whatever is smashed, and he smiles. He's like, I can't even remember why I was angry. Like, all I cared was that his wound was bound, you know what I mean? And he goes, there was a time where I took him to the park, and we're on this climbing frame, and Keaton keeps like climbing up the climbing frame and then jumping off, and Jermaine catches him and does it again, he catches him, does it again, he catches him. And then he says, my arms are getting tired, Daddy's arms are getting tired, this is the last one, all right? And so he jumps off and catches him. He says, all right, that's it. He puts him down. And he's like walking away, and he says, something in me tells me to turn around. And as I turn around, he's there just jumping. And he's midair. And he catches him. And again, he's like frustrated. He's like, I told you not to jump. And Keelan goes, but Daddy, I knew that you would catch me. And like, we're just, all just sobbing. And he doesn't say much else. And in these two stories, it's like this dad acknowledging the points of failure that we all feel as parents, of like, you speak about in your book, of like, just, the frustration and the anger that's just there. But then also like the expectation that's so innate in a child of like, will you bind up my wounds and will you catch me when I fall? And I'm like, that's the manifesto. Like, that's what every young man needs. Will you bind my wounds and will you catch me when I fall? And as long as I don't have an image of that, like, my relationship to my wounds is going to be different. And my expectation of like trust in the world is going to be different. And there's just some amazing examples of people doing this that I'm aware of in terms of, the initiation for men, for young men. Some brilliant men around the world who are like reclaiming the art of initiation. And those are the fundamentals of it. Welcome into a community of men where we will bind your wounds and we will catch you when you fall. You know what I mean? So your wounds are no longer your excuse for living in this perpetual cycle of wounding others, nor is like your suspicion about the world your kind of invitation to create more systems that oppress. And, you know, that's ruined me. Do you know what I mean? It's just like, that's it. And if I can get a little Jesus-y, you know, like the initiation of Jesus is an initiation into the beloved, you know. Yeah. Behold, that is my son, who I love, in whom I'm well pleased, and upon whom my favor rests. And like once or twice a week, I'm in a prison and I'm sitting with men, and I know their whole life would be different if they had heard those words. And then what we talk about now is like, it's not too late. Do you know what I mean? Yeah. Those words are still ringing out over you. You know what I mean? What did you want from this life? Yeah. To call myself beloved, to feel myself beloved upon this earth. So, yeah, I probably, I don't know, I'm probably the latter to your two things. I don't have too many, you know, I feel suspicious of like any kind of man up language. But I also feel suspicious perhaps of any like, you know, forsaking the identity of what it is to be a man. Yeah. A man who binds wounds and a man who catches those that fall. Yeah.
Would you mind reading the poem you mentioned about your dad's tears?
Yeah. I'm going to do a little intro to this one just because I've never said it before, but I read a poem at the funeral of my best friend who passed, and I had the honor of leading her funeral. And I was trying to find something to summarize the service, and I was sat out struggling in the night beforehand, and out of nowhere, this friend sent me a text with this poem. And the author it's unclear who wrote this one, but it's about a ship that sails from the harbor, and it's kind of a meditation on death. And it basically ends with, you know, though this ship is growing smaller in my sight, her diminishing size is only from my perspective, because as I say, there she goes on a far and distant shore, someone else says, here she comes, you know. And when my grandfather died, my dad asked for a poem, and I gave him that. And I'd never seen my dad cry, despite all the things he'd been through. But when he read that poem, he started sobbing. And he looked at me and said, can you get up here and read it? And I said, no, because I was enamored. The first time I saw my father cry was after his father died, who he laid to rest in a garden where he lays next to his child. So tell the reaper to wait a while, be a gentleman. Don't come up here in Satan style. I'm spending time with my brethren. Let me talk to God and shake denial, play with my child, wake up and paint the skies with the colors of my favorite eyes. We miss so much looking back on it, waiting for that rapture or getting our phones out to capture it. But the photos on the camera roll tell the story of an anxious soul. You and I are growing old. These fields of green are turning gold, and as day turns to night, and as the sun sets over our home and it's time we say goodbye, I pray that we say nothing at all, because I told you everything you meant to me. And sometimes I get a temper, but that's just because everything is temporary. And it's then that I remember what you said to me. Before you rest your head in sleep, just be grateful that you get to breathe, because the irony in it all is the most anxious thought in my mind is about missing out on what is already mine. Joy is hard to find, but only because I'm blind. Like when I open up my eyes, I find it everywhere I look. And I don't know how this story ends, but I pray they find me grateful and say I was extravagantly wasteful with the love I had to give, as if I learned to live like it was never running out.
Thank you. One of the things I was wondering about as I was preparing this interview is what gives some people permission to speak about these deep things. And it feels to me that you can talk about binding up wounds and healing and a community of men because you sort of earned it, right? Like you have been to the dark place and you are with people whose lives have fallen apart in prison. And frankly, because you've got a big old beard and tattoos, right? There's something about the tribal signifiers and who we do and don't trust, right? Like, I could say some of the things that you're saying, and there is no reason that young men would listen to me rightly, right? But they can listen to you because it feels like there's an ability to have been in their shoes and feel what they feel, that people, you know. And I just kind of wanted to name that and ask, how much are you seeing this thing that is showing up in the data? That there's some data from Bible Society out just this week, and that I think you and I have both spoken and written about this like upswing of interest in spirituality from people who might have either rejected the church in the past or just have had no contact with it, and there being a particular just higher numbers of young men. Just love to hear, like, have you been seeing that? And if so, what do you think is going on with it?
Yeah, I think to your first point, I haven't thought too deeply about how I present, but I think it's an interesting...
Probably better that we don't.
yeah, it's true. I will say this, in those environments I've been where there's a more kind of extreme gathering of dysfunctional or destructive people, there's always been someone who bucks the trend, and in their obscurity and kind of eccentric nature is the point of redemption for these guys. Do you know what I mean? And I feel like, to push back a little bit,
please,
I can feel what you carry. And I know you're not asking me to tell you this, but and if I could give it a word, to quote Saint Brene Brown, like, the vulnerability and the authority that comes with vulnerability, I think, is that pathway. You know what I mean? Whether you've got tats or not, you know, I think that's, man. And if you've been through the valley of the shadow, you pick it up quick. You know what I mean? Like, it's just there. It's just there. It's like, I know you paid for your words. You know what I mean? Your words are expensive, and they've cost you something. And I'd probably continue that thought into that second observation you've made, where surely we are in the most heightened place of, like, the human story, where our desire for authenticity, I mean, could it get any higher than it is now? Like, could we have experienced the level of superficiality that we've experienced? Like, could we actually have a more superficial society than we have now? Perhaps with, you know, advancements in, maybe when AI gets to its full extent, maybe. But I think, like, we have a spirituality of wounds. Like, we have a risen Lord with wounds. It's no surprise to me that in the age of, like, authenticity, the story of Jesus is coming back around. You know what I mean? Where it's like, oh, your God has scars? Yup. You know what I mean? Yeah. Your God got beaten. Your God got beaten up. I've been in the rooms where it's like, yeah, your God got beaten up. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not paying any attention. Yeah. But I think the upswing I'm seeing in men is around that. It isn't the macho warrior God. You know what I mean? Yeah. It's not that. It's the wounded Christ. It's the wounded healer. You know what I mean? Yeah. That's why I feel like there is a longing for that, a permissional longing for that, of an actual, authentic, you can talk to this God in your actual voice. Yeah. You know, like, you can have an actual conversation. So maybe naively, I think that's my reflection on it. I don't think it's a huge intellectual, like, people being enamored from that perspective. I think it's the tidal wave of, we want something real. And our story has always been that. Whether or not we've articulated it well, our story has always been that. Born in martyrdom, you know? Yeah, beautiful. I want to close on something that's related to that, which is a phrase and a concept that you have become well known for, which is, this is the main event. And my kind of particular favorite that you sometimes say around it is, the door is in the floor. So could you just say a little bit about that concept and kind of why it's become so central to your writing and speaking? Yeah, it's an accident. You know, it's like 5 years ago, my wife and I, in the throes of having a baby, just bump into the walls of our life. This phrase, this is it, can be said in one of two ways. You know, this is it, or this is it. The life you long for is hidden in the life you have. You know, there's no ladder that's going to take you where you want to go. It's actually getting more rooted in the life you have. And I'm saying this not as a sage or as someone who's mastered it. I'm saying it, if we can summarize the whole conversation.
Matches that we need.
Right?
Come from ourselves.
Like, this is it. And so my wife and I just start throwing it around of like, this is the main event. There is no life beyond this one. David White, I love him. This is the world to which you belong, you know? And we would say it and our friends would start saying it and I once put it on social media and like people would start saying it. I was like, oh, there's some resonance here. You know, the Desert Fathers and the kind of the holy phrase of like, the kingdom of heaven is within. Yeah. Just one phrase that would take them into this place of, oh, I'm back in my zen, you know? And that's what it was for us. Like, this is the main event. And again, I guess perhaps there hasn't been a time with so many options and so many opportunities, and it's destroying us. And that simple phrase roots me back into my life in all of its fragility and limitation. Like, we're all going to end up old if we make it. Yeah. If we actually make it, then we end up old with a quiet life. Yeah. And we end up in a life with even more limitation than they do now. At some point, people are going to stop calling me, do you know what I mean, to do anything. Yeah. And then maybe at some point, the people around me are going to stop calling me because I'm old and I don't call my grandma as much as I should. Do you know what I mean? At some point, it's going to get really quiet. Yeah. And I'm preparing for that, trying. Yeah. I think there's a part of us that just wants to prepare for that now. Of like, let's live a life which is rooted in the here and now. Yeah. And when death finds us, may she find us alive. Yeah. Amen.
Joshua Luke Smith, thank you so much for speaking to me today on The Sacred.
Thank you for having me. I love your work and I'm grateful for you.
Ditto. Well, it's funny. Most guests, when I'm preparing to record this reflection, I listen back and I kind of pull out different themes that have stuck out for me. This one is almost entirely just quotes, which I guess is what you get when you interview a poet with such facility for words. And the first one is, what is sacred within me comes from what aches within me. I mean, just sit with that for a moment. If you're someone who's new to the podcast or you've been listening for a long time and you're still struggling to figure out what is sacred to you, maybe you could start with that. What aches within you? And it was such a beautiful thing that you said about friendship, you know, this sense of, do I belong? How do I show up in the world in a way that helps me see and be seen, know others and be known? And the sort of lasting impression of Joshua is of this powerful vulnerability. And I think both those words are true, that there's something powerful about him and something powerfully vulnerable about him. And it was summarized in that line of like, what it means to be Josh is to be an 8-year-old asking, will you be my friend? So again, I want to go, okay, what does it mean to be me? What does it mean to be you? What are these deep defining experiences that shape our decisions just below usually our conscious awareness? I'm always interested in cultural stories and kind of cultural archetypes, and it was really helpful to explore with him this kind of sense of what are our associations with the word missionary, and to both acknowledge, you know, as he said, he's been to places in the world and he's seen the legacy of mission in parts of the world that is kind of ego and empire, but it was really good, I think, to hear a different story, you know, a different thread in the tapestry, which the stories of his parents being, yes, naive, but incredibly powerfully loving, you know, and I'm sure in these failing ways, but also in these really meaningful ways, you know, being a doctor and wanting to go and build a hospital to help people and giving away all of your stuff for refugees. And the contrast of that with our culture, as he said, is like when he backed into someone's driveway, being afraid that someone would come up and say, like, get off my driveway, get off my land. This desire to have a posture that's not about controlling what is ours, but is about giving what we have and sharing what we have with others. St. Francis as the last Christian. Oh my goodness, the challenge of the New Testament that both Josh and I are trying to live by, and both also know how far short we fall of its ridiculously radical call to a loving and just and other-centered life. the other thing he said about the time in Pakistan as a missionary was there was just a profound honesty about how he spoke about it, that they grew up in the shadow of his mum's depression, and that through it she's learnt stuff that she is able to tell others. And he used this phrase, who God is to you is who God is through you. And I know not everyone listening will even believe in God or the divine, but those of us who have some concept of that, this idea that what our kind of mental model or unexamined associations are with that word will really affect what we're able to bring to others, how we're able to be present to others, how we're able to love our neighbours. We also spoke about ADHD and, such a vivid portrait of Josh causing carnage, being unconstrained dynamite, getting expelled, getting into fights, taking a bunch of drugs. And again, whenever you hear someone's story, the ability to empathise with both them and with people acting in similar ways really goes up. And I was thinking how clearly when he was telling that story of the teacher throwing chewing gum in her hair and having her say, no one's ever done things so cruel. If I was just hearing that story recounted, and excuse my language, but I think this is what most people would think, I would just think, that little shit, that thoughtless kid, which of course he was, both of those things. And yet, when you know a bit more about what's going on with someone, it doesn't excuse the behaviour, but it does help us understand what might be needed. And I'm so glad that Josh's parents were able to respond with such kind of level-headedness and love and work out how to channel some of that energy and explosiveness that was coming through as he tried to navigate the particular way that he's made. And I guess it's the legacy of that parenting and getting to rock bottom, really, and being in the recovery movement that's left him with such a legacy of self-awareness. And it's just always delightful to speak to someone who knows themselves like that, who can say, yes, I'm drawn to the chaos. I have a high tolerance of chaos, and that can cause harm sometimes. But it also means I have a particular gift, right? I can be someone who can speak into the chaos and have the self-awareness of knowing that you're someone who needs higher discipline, maybe, than other people. That, this phrase of being on a short leash, which, again, I kind of reacted against, which says a lot about my temperament and reaction to discipline. But to have that reframe of actually being a form of intimacy, like an intimacy in his spirituality, that he has to stay close. There are things that other people can do without soul danger that he cannot do. And there's other quote, a poet is a witness, offering words in the service of the unsayable. Wow. Offering words in the service of the unsayable. I love the paradox of that. I love this posture of witnessing and paying attention. I get back again and again to this Simone Weil quote about attention being the rarest and purest form of generosity. And I think Ralph Alsberger said, listening for most people is so close to being loved as to be indistinguishable. Those are the two quotes that frame so much of the work that I'm trying to do, because they remind us that listening and paying attention to the world and to each other are not soft side activities, that they are how we love and therefore how we become. And then we ended on this stuff about masculinity. And I've just been in Baltimore preaching an amazing church, which is right on the line between incredibly rich and wealthy Baltimore, which I didn't really know existed, but is astonishingly fancy. And the Baltimore, which those of us who've seen The Wire will find more familiar, which is streets and streets and streets of closed up, boarded up, burnt out houses and just endemic addiction and gun crime. And every week in that service, the church has a slot for neighbour prayer, and they pray for all the local community organisations trying to bring healing, and they pray for their neighbours that have been murdered, killed in violence that week. And there's often more than one, and they only had 1 week last year where there was none. And so in that service, we said the name of a man who'd been killed, who had 3 children. And I was reminded of that as Joshua was talking about that vigil in Brixton and how these questions about violence and masculinity and fathering and woundedness and vulnerability are all mixed up together, and that we can have policy responses, and we should, and we can have kind of community organisation responses, and we should. And at the deep level, I think there is something very true in what Josh said, that what every young man needs is a community of men who will bind up their wounds and catch them when they fall. And so as I continue to think about masculinity and some of those divides and divisions and differences and disagreements, I want to keep turning my attention to celebrate the people who are doing that, the men that are doing that, even when sometimes they're doing it in ways that are not, particularly to my preference or to my tastes, to celebrate it. And I want to celebrate the way Josh is fathering, but also the way, he's just one of many, many men stepping into the responsibility of that healing work. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of The Sacred. My name is Elizabeth Oldfield. Our production team are Dan Turner, Lydia Taylor, Amari Ugandran, Lizzie Harvey, and Drew Hawley. Our music is by Luke Stanley, and Theos is a project, I always get this wrong, The Sacred is a project of the think tank Theos. Thank you so much for listening, and I will speak to you next time.